Hello, good afternoon from Europe. Good morning if you are joining from the other sides of the Atlantic from the United States. And welcome to everyone to this CSS Web Talk entitled NATO in Times of Russia's War Against Ukraine and Trump 2 with Professor Jason Davidson as our speaker. My name is Gesine Weber and I'm a senior researcher at CSS, the Center for Security Studies. The year is not even 2 years old, 2 months old, and still, like those who have been following NATO and transatlantic security very closely, certainly had a very busy beginning of this year. And it was even enough to just watch the news and follow the potential threats around of US President Trump to quote unquote take Greenland, or the recent speeches at the Munich Security Conference to see that the alliance is clearly not in its best state at the moment, to say the least. However, it is also important to consider in this context that European security has actually really profoundly and fundamentally changed over the last almost 4 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also even more so over the last year since the election or re-election of US President Trump in the United States. On this background, the role of NATO as a military alliance and its effectiveness in European security still depend on the extent to which the allies will be able to find common responses to these extremely pressing questions. And I couldn't think of anyone better than Professor Jason Davidson to discuss this question with us today. Jason is a professor of political science and the director of the Security and Conflict Studies program at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative, and he has an impressive track record of publications with peer-reviewed articles that have been published in journals in academic journals, but Jason has also published 5 books, and his most recent book with the title NATO After Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Threat Perceptions and Their Consequences, published with Georgetown University Press in 2026, so really hot off the press, compiles an impressive analysis of threat perceptions, defense decision-making, and strategic thinking in 6 major NATO allies. Before we dive into this book and before Jason shares insights on that, we will of course also see all that in the context of what is currently happening in European security and NATO, and Jason will address all these easy or not so easy questions with us. 2 more remarks before we start. For those who don't know the CSS think tank yet, the CSS think tank is part of the Center for Security Studies, a center of competence for national and international security policy, which the Swiss Federal Council has designated as a national task and entrusted to the ETH in Zurich. Within the teams, the CSS think tank addresses a broad range of security-related fields. So what you see here today, the discussion on NATO and European security, is just a snippet of the work that is being conducted at the center. And like the entire CSS, the think tank is independent, non-partisan, and committed to academic freedom, something certainly worth mentioning today, especially as we have heated political conversations. And second, that is the operational notice for all those who tune in today. This is that if you want to ask questions during the webinar, you have a little button for Q&A on the bottom of your screen, and we invite you to submit your questions there so Jason can answer them throughout the webinar. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Jason. Say thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Jason, for sharing your views.
Thank you, Gesine. And thank you all for your time today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing what questions you all have. But I will take a few minutes and sort of outline what the book says. So the book sort of takes issue with a conventional wisdom view that you all might be aware of. And it might be useful to think, to go back in time roughly 4 years. So not quite 4 years, but if we think about the summer of 2022, so as you all will be aware, tomorrow will be the fourth year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as of the summer of 2022, NATO was getting together for a major summit, the Madrid summit. And they happen to also be putting together a new strategic concept, which is the document that really organizes the alliance, major threats the alliance faces and how to go about addressing them. The previous document had essentially said that there was no significant security threat to Europe of any major nature. The Madrid strategic concept was fundamentally different. It said that the Russian Federation was, quote, the most significant and direct threat to Allies' security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. A similar view was expressed by lots of analysts at the time, and even moving forward up through 2024 and the 75th annual or anniversary summit that NATO had in Washington, D.C. People had the view, as American General and former Director of the CIA David Petraeus said, that Vladimir Putin had tried to make Russia great again, but instead invading Ukraine, he had made NATO great again. The view was that NATO was unified in its view of the threat from Russia. In my book, I conducted 98 elite interviews in 6 major European allies. And the book argues that instead the reality is more complex. That instead NATO allies face different threats and different levels of threat. So yes, many allies are concerned with Russia, but even then the level of concern with Russia varies significantly across the alliance. And that there are important allies who don't see Russia as the most important threat to them. So I'm going to say a little bit more about this, but the first question that I asked in every interview that I conducted of policymakers and analysts was, what is the most important security threat facing your country? And I heard some really different things across these six major allies. The other thing that came out of the book that I'll just mention briefly and then come back to in a second is that the historical experiences of these allies, their identities, is important as well. And I didn't really expect to find that, but it ended up being somewhat important. The book tries to trace the importance of threat perceptions and identity and its impact on major defense decisions that allies make. So this is why it matters for NATO that allies have these different threat perceptions and different identities. So those major defense decisions include things like how much they spend on defense, but also the military structure. So what kinds of military capabilities they develop, and their military posture. So where their military forces are deployed. So I'm going to go really quickly through those 6 allies, and I'm going to break them down into 3 categories. So the first category are those that see Russia as a very serious and existential threat. And I would say those 2 allies are Poland most clearly, and that's probably not going to be a surprise to anybody on the webinar, but to a lesser extent and increasingly over time, Germany. So in both cases, geography, of course, plays a role. And if I'm sure you all have an excellent sense of European geography, but the position of both countries relative to Russia is significant in terms of why they see Russia as a threat to them as well as a threat to European security. Both of these countries, because they have this higher perception, Poland, of course, has a very high level of defense spending. So between 4.5% and now approaching 5% in the past year and coming years. They have militaries that either, in Poland's case, are focused on territorial defense, so just focused on defending their territorial integrity. In Germany's case, moving toward that with lots of new capabilities purchases. Germany's defense spending has been increasing, now at about 2.5% from 2025, based on what we hear. and that both of them are focused on the eastern flank in terms of NATO, in terms of their military posture. Germany specifically developing this brigade in Lithuania, and we could talk about that more. Second category of country are countries that see Russia as a threat, but more as a threat to European security and not to their own territorial integrity specifically. And this would be Britain and France. So in both of these cases, the defense spending is somewhat lower, and France, in French defense spending as of 2025 is still right at about the 2% mark, for example. In addition, both of these countries have a military structure that continues to be provide for capabilities that allow them to engage in small deployments abroad for military intervention, counterterrorism, those types of operations. And both countries have military postures that are global. So, for example, France has troops deployed in around the world from the South Pacific to South America, right? And including forces deployed in Africa and a number of countries, in Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti in Africa in large quantities. Britain in Brunei, Bahrain, Cyprus. How do we make sense of those deployments? Not from the perspective of their concern with Russia, but rather because of aspects of their identity I alluded to before. So in both Britain and France, what I heard was that these countries continue to see themselves as global powers, and being global powers, they have to have both military capabilities and deployments around the world because that's what is appropriate. And then finally, the third category, we have countries that I looked at that do not see Russia as the most important threat to them. So those two countries I'll talk about separately here because they're rather different, Italy and the United States. In Rome, overwhelmingly what I heard was that instability in the wider Mediterranean, this is the term that Italians use, the wider Mediterranean, Mediterraneo allargato, is the threat facing them. If you face a threat from the wider Mediterranean, a threat that is manifest in uncontrolled migration, in terrorism, in trafficking in illegal substances, in threats to maritime commerce, military force is not probably going to be the best way to address that threat. And in fact, we can then look at Italy's relatively low level of defense spending as appropriate, given that circumstance. Italy also has a military structure that is focused on deployments, peace type deployments. And in fact, they have over 11,000 troops deployed in 25 countries around the world. This is both because of their concern with instability in the Mediterranean. So they have a force, for example, in Lebanon, but it's also related to their post-war identity of pacifism and promoting peace in the world. What about the United States? Well, the United States, of course, is the alliance's, has been the alliance's most important and most powerful member. The United States, as of 2024, when I ended the interviews for the project, very focused on China as the most important threat. And by the way, I heard that from people across the political spectrum in the United States, including individuals who went on to join the Trump administration, but at the time were in other positions. I heard China is the most important security threat that we face. Of course, that's changed a little bit in the Trump administration. I'm happy to discuss that. But if your focus is on China, then you're going to need to spend a lot on defense, which the United States does. You're going to need to have a defense structure that is focused on fighting a peer competitor, which mostly is what the United States military structure looks like. And you're going to need a global military posture, including large contingents of troops, both in the Indo-Pacific, but we also know a large contingent of troops in Europe as well. So I'm happy to talk more in Q&A about how the book relates to the current crisis, the crisis over the past year in transatlantic relations. But the overall takeaway that I would offer is just that those who talk about NATO as an entity, as a single entity that is focused on Russia, are oversimplifying the case, that in fact the reality is more complex, and that we need to have a sense of the textures of alliance, of threat perceptions within the alliance, if we want to make sense of how NATO is dealing with the current challenge and the challenges it will face over the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for this kickoff and giving us an overview of the findings of your book. I would like to bring this a bit to the current debate, as you said you finished your research and the interviews by the end of 2024, which also almost coincides with the second Trump administration taking over again. We saw a new national security strategy published by the end of 2025. So could you elaborate on where you see especially the threat perceptions of the US trending now, but also more generally where you see the US trajectory in terms of alliances, in terms of NATO specifically, and what that means for Europeans?
Yes, thank you, Gazina. So in terms of the US, the thing that has been most striking that has changed in the past year, and I think really a lot of analysts, specialists in US defense and security policy have been surprised by how much the Trump administration has focused on the Western Hemisphere. So that's been the really marked difference. Their view that the United States has to, in the, I think the National Defense Strategy language is be dominant in the Western Hemisphere, personally puzzling as to how that's even a question. There is no other power that is even capable of being close to the United States in power terms in the Western Hemisphere, but nonetheless, their focus on the Western Hemisphere, and we could talk about why, but I'll just throw out that the domestic politics of migration and the domestic politics of the illegal drug issue seem to be a part of this story. Let me be very clear before we get a flood of questions rolling in. I am not saying that the action that the United States has taken thus far in Venezuela is in any way designed to address either the migration problem or the drug problem, but rather that it is sort of linked in the administration's mind to things that at least average Americans might think would address those problems. But so Western Hemisphere is number one. The other thing that I have to say on China is we've really seen some very mixed signals. So on the one hand, the National Defense Strategy that I just alluded to says that the United States will prevent a change in balance of power in Indo-Pacific that could lead to China becoming dominant in the Indo-Pacific. So pretty clear there that they see China as a bit of a problem. However, the administration does seem also very interested, and the president seems very interested in ratcheting down tensions with Beijing, particularly prior to this summit that President Trump is going to have with Xi Jinping. So I'm not 100%, I don't think anyone is really 100% sure of where the administration stands on its view of China as a threat. That is sort of yet to be determined. Probably lots of struggle within the administration. We know that there are a number of figures, Elbridge Colby, but also probably the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that were pretty vehement China hawks before this administration started, probably continue to be so, and then others that maybe are a little bit less concerned with China. Finally, on the alliance question, I think even there, there are some real questions. My default view is that the administration does not value alliances at all, but definitely not NATO in any significant way. However, there are also instances, and there is also some evidence that perhaps they think that these relationships are important. They're just not demonstrating value in their actions. So again, the National Defense Strategy says, well, Russia's a problem. It's just not the most important problem we face. And we're going to let we want Europeans to be strong so that they can address that problem. Aspects of Marco Rubio's speech at Munich seem to also lean in that direction, that the US would like Europe to be strong and thus be able to address challenges that it faces. I am I tend to lean more toward the view that the president of the United States, who's the most important player, does not value these alliances very much at all. But there probably are some others in the administration that do find some value in those alliances.
Thank you for these insights. I will already link the next question I'm asking to one that was asked in the chat. But before that, I will also call again upon the webinar participants here. If you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. And I want to use one of the questions that were asked, namely whether the Italian interviewees explained to you how NATO could help responding to their perceived threats. And I mean, that also ties to the broader question, how can NATO as an alliance, which also which fully depends on what NATO allies basically can agree on, how can NATO as an alliance be effective and address all these different security threats when you're having a very multifaceted threat perception within the alliance? I mean, we had a few years ago, and also in the latest strategic concept, there were all these ideas of NATO 360 and NATO in the Mediterranean, and looking really beyond purely the classic territorial defense or the three key pillars. But how would you say can an alliance work when you have so many allies that look in so many different directions?
Excellent questions. Thank you. So first of all, what does, and by the way, I was trying to be as concise as possible before, but when I looked at these 6 countries, because these are the 6 most important countries in terms of economic size and in terms of military spending, right? But I do think that Italy, for example, is representative of allies on the southern flank. So Spain has similar views. Obviously, Greece and Turkey have the conflict with each other that's important. But in addition, they also have concerns that are somewhat similar. Portugal, maybe even some other allies, but definitely those allies would share Italy's concerns, I think, if you talk to them and there's evidence of that. So what do they want out of the alliance? That's your number one question. What I heard a diversity of answers on this in Rome. What I often heard was more. They want NATO to do more. And so what we saw, for example, in 2024 at the Washington summit was the Spanish Prime Minister announced that the alliance was moving forward on something called the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan, which was basically more engagement with partners in some NATO has, as some of you will be aware, the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative that are partner activities with countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan was pushing for more engagement. So there is a new, Javier Colomina is now the NATO's special representative for the South, and has been engaged in, over the past year and a half, essentially a listening tour and more engagement. I do think we will see Italy, Spain, and others pushing for more engagement by the alliance in the southern flank, although we've just heard some pushback on NATO's activities outside of Europe by the Trump administration. So that might be a bit of a problem there. And then pivoting a little bit to the question of how can NATO deal with these different threats at the same time. So the first thing that I would say is that, yes, and this is where the default view, the conventional view that I started the talk with, the present in the Madrid strategic concept is correct. Russia is the most significant threat facing the alliance. I don't doubt that, and I think even allies like Italy realize that for the alliance as a whole, Russia is the most significant threat, even if it's not the most significant threat for them. So that's the first thing, and that's where most of the alliance's resources will be targeted. And even the Italians would say, yes, we want the alliance to do more on the southern flank, but they're not asking for, looking for, demanding lots of resources from the alliance in order to do that. So the alliance, for example, NATO has had something called Operation Sea Guardian since 2016. And it's a naval operation in the Mediterranean. That operation is pretty low in terms of resources. The other thing about NATO's engagement with the South that the Italians have also picked up on is that a lot of the engagement in the South is designed or can be viewed as a way to respond to Russia's engagement in North Africa, in the Sahel, etc. And so the more NATO is engaged with these partners, the less those partners would turn toward Russia or allow for an opening toward Russia. And then the final thing I would say is I think the bigger challenge here would be the pull, and we've seen this over the past decade or so, for the alliance to also be involved in the Indo-Pacific. And there has been a debate over this. I personally have always been on the side that European countries, I think, have their resources spread thin enough already, and that engagement in the Indo-Pacific is not something that NATO should be doing. And that appears to also be where the Trump administration is at. So I do think that from that perspective, the US should focus on the Indo-Pacific and the NATO allies should focus closer to home. Thanks.
Thank you. That already, I think, alludes to basically the elephant in the room, which is that Europeans have to do more in NATO under the Trump administration, which is, I think, not only due to the re-election of Donald Trump, but also really due to the fact that Europe has underinvested over decades and that the security environment has so significantly changed. And what we have been observing in this context over the last, I would say, 4 years, is that the EU has really taken a more significant role, although it is mostly limited to defense financing and funding the defense industrial efforts at the moment. Where do you see the opportunities and maybe limits of the EU to contribute to European security and potentially also to build a stronger European pillar in NATO to alleviate the burden from the United States a bit more and rebalance the alliance?
Yeah, so first of all, what I think is fascinating is because of the Trump administration is something to recognize, as you said, big elephant in the room. It does seem that the Trump administration's threats to use force to seize Greenland had a catalytic and a fundamental effect in the sense that we're not going back to previous views of European trusts of the United States and its willingness to come to the aid of a European if attacked. I think there's a lot more doubt in a lot more minds than there was before that moment, even though Trump ultimately seems to have backed down. Fingers crossed that is how things stayed. So there certainly is a lot more motive and a lot more incentive for European governments to be thinking about an alternative to NATO moving forward. And I think, there's probably at least some idea or concern that if the United States were to get to a point where it's actually going to sabotage European defense through NATO, that would be the worst case scenario, rather than just the United States doing less in NATO. That would, of course, accelerate such moves. For the foreseeable future, however, NATO is the game in town that has the interoperability, it has the defense planning features, it has a command structure, it has so many things in terms of what you would need in order to both deter potential aggression by Russia, but also defend against a Russian attack if such an attack occurred, that the EU simply does not have and would have to develop, could develop over time, but does not have those features. That's, I guess, the most fundamental thing that I would say. Now, of course, you're right that, and this is what I expect we will be seeing moving forward, is more European efforts to help countries coordinate their development of a defense industrial base within Europe, defense spending, and spending particularly on the right things so that Europeans can develop. We haven't quite gotten into this yet, but the so-called critical enablers that the United States has that European allies do not have. And I think the EU could play a role in that. I personally am hopeful that those who value European security in the administration will help the process of European development of critical enablers as they plan to step back from European security, because that does seem the trend. And I should say that regardless of this Greenland discussion or other, the civilizational erasure or the other points of tension, the one point in the Trump administration that is clear that also ties back to what we would have heard in, let's say, a Harris administration had Kamala Harris won the 2024 election, is the idea that the United States will be doing less in Europe and the Europeans will do more. So that is, in my view, that ship has sailed. That is something that will happen. It's just a question of how rapid it happens and how much the United States helps Europeans move forward. So if it were, in my view, most of these changes will happen through NATO, is the most likely outcome, with the European Union in a assisting role.
I think you mentioned a very important phrase that we have been hearing over and over again since 2022, also because it has simply been reaffirmed by the security reality on the European continent, which is that NATO is basically the only game in town when it comes to deterrence and defense. And one important aspect of that has always been the US nuclear umbrella over Europe. And also really the idea of collective deterrence, including nuclear deterrence. And on this background, how, or do you have insights how the US does currently assess the threat from Russia, especially in the nuclear realm, and whether there are any adaptations of nuclear policy seen, either in terms of potential nuclear arms control with the administration or potentially rethinking the posture in Europe?
Right. So fortunately, that's one of the nice things, or the positive elements that we have seen relatively recently, is that there has been a reaffirmation in the past month of US commitment to provide the extended deterrent to Europe. That's in the National Defense Strategy, for example, and it continues to be, as far as we can tell, the official view of the Trump administration that US nuclear deterrent will continue to extend to Europe. Part of the view continues to be, of course, which I think makes sense, that if the United States would withdraw that extended deterrent, that proliferation in Europe would be more likely, and that it seems like the United States is not in favor of that. The Trump administration sort of sees the downsides of that. From everything that I gather, the administration is only willing to really move forward on any kind of new arms control if it also involves China, and the Chinese aren't willing to participate because of the size of their arsenal. So they sort of feel like they don't really belong in the discussion. They want to still be able to develop for an extended period of time without any limits. So that seems to be the view of the Trump administration. We know that there are nuclear modernization efforts underway in the United States. And appears that the administration has just talked about this new additional $500 billion that it is asking for on defense, and at least some of that appears that it will go into nuclear modernization efforts. So presumably the concern is that the United States would have to prepare for a reality in which it would face a potential conflict with both Russia and China at the same time. And thus, what I'm gathering from people in the administration is that they don't really think that arms control makes much sense, because the United States is going to have to expand its arsenal in the near to medium term to be able to deal with the prospect of conflict between the United States and Russia and China at the same time. So pretty clearly, that view seems to assume that there is a possibility of a nuclear conflict involving Russia, and thus that Russia is a threat. I don't know if that gets at all of your question.
Thank you. I still have a few more.
Okay.
I would indeed like to stay in Europe and on the question of disarmament, arms control, and potentially also future peace process on Ukraine at the moment. A thing, or an institution rather, that is also every now and then mentioned in the European discussions, although I think it has lost a lot of traction over the last years, is the OSCE. And is there any thought about the institution and how it could potentially contribute to the future of European security in Washington?
I don't think in this particular administration has disdain for international institutions more broadly. I think folks on the webinar will not be surprised when I say that. Pre-existing institutions, institutions that were part of the liberal international order, they scoff at, they disdain, and they don't really want to have anything to do with. The view is that Trump and/or Trump's envoys meeting directly with people, no matter what the issue, are the best way to solve these problems, not working through traditional institutions. So thus the Board of Peace is sort of his own creation. So that's probably the only institution that the administration likes. And just on Ukraine, yeah, I don't see any prospect with the only thing that I guess we could note that is significant is that there does seem to be increasing reports that the administration is just getting annoyed, tired with the peace process, and so they're just probably going to disengage. As if we had to make a prediction of what's coming in the next months or year, is that probably since it's unlikely that there would be a breakthrough in peace negotiations, that the administration will just sort of walk away and leave the Europeans to continue to provide aid to Ukraine, buying military aid from the United States, possibly and hopefully still providing intelligence to Ukraine, but otherwise the Trump administration will probably just take it off the agenda.
Thank you. From Ukraine, I would like to bring it to another major challenge for Europeans, when both sides, the US and Europe, basically agree that Europe has to do more on European defense. That also always comes with the defense industrial imperatives and the defense industrial discussions. And we have seen that many European states, after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, basically rushed to the United States and did a lot of off-the-shelf buying of existing systems, especially the F-35s. But on the other hand, now we've also seen over the last 2 years that especially the European and EU defense industrial agenda has really been taking up, and that there are significant discussions about made in Europe, and also a higher willingness of European states to basically spend there. When you're, for example, looking at Germany's current budget for defense acquisitions, only 8% will go to the United States, which is relatively unprecedented. So my question would be, or the question from the chat would be, that on which I'm building, is what is the US view, or the view of the current US administration, on European defense procurement at this moment of burden shifting? Does it see Europe as a competitor when Europe pursues its own European defense industrial agenda? Is that something that is seen as positive? And dependent on your answer, how do you think this is going to impact alliance cohesion? Are we running into the next alliance crisis by Europeans pursuing something they are said to do, but not pursuing it in the way the United States wants them to do? Or does the US just not care where Europeans spend?
Yes, thank you. So again, a great question, really important issue moving forward. And let me distinguish between, very clearly between what it seems like the administration is doing and what I think they should be doing. So on the one hand, I hope this is clear up until this point, I personally very much support the push for Europeans to do more to develop their own capacity to defend themselves and to move toward that moment when they can do so. And defense spending is not sufficient to achieve that outcome, but it is more defense spending is necessary to achieve that outcome, right? A necessary but insufficient condition. The administration, and we just saw, it was just news reports over the weekend of the Trump administration criticizing Europeans for not buying enough from the United States. I've been suspicious for a long time that part of Trump's view in pushing Europe, this is back to his first term, that pushing Europeans to spend more on defense, he was thinking about this from the perspective of if they spend more on defense, they're going to buy more from US defense contractors. That was one of his logics from the very beginning. In terms of why because it didn't really make sense to me because he didn't seem to care about Russia as a security threat ever. So why would he care if Europeans spend more on defense? Certainly, he's never argued that because Europeans are going to spend more on defense, the United States is somehow going to spend less on defense, right? He's never made that argument. So what is in it for the United States? He always sees it as what's in it for us. So what's in it for the United States? And I've always thought that he, in his heart of hearts, really had the idea that this was about the Europeans would sort of be forced to spend more on U.S. Weapons and weapon systems because we're one of the leaders in the world in producing those systems. Now, what I just cannot quite comprehend at the present moment is how people in the administration do not understand that the only way that most European governments are going to be able to justify or one of the only ways that European governments are going to be able to justify to their public why they need to, maybe cut social programs or incur more debt is if some of that spending is also going into companies on their own soil. That is that people are, getting jobs or more jobs, or they're expanding the production of factories. In Rheinmetall or some of these other companies, the important Italian companies, important French companies, etc., Swedish companies. So the idea that European governments somehow are going to be able to spend, and particularly even get anywhere close, most of them, to 3.5% of spending on defense without spending a lot of that new money at home is absurd. So I do see, very sadly, I think you're right. I do see very much this as if the U.S. government persists in demanding that most of the new spending be with U.S. firms, I just see that as ultimately putting forward a major impasse between the U.S. and European allies.
Yes, and I would potentially even add even among European allies, because I can very well imagine that some European allies will be very much inclined to do the Trump administration the favor and buy American and potentially kind of buy their security guarantees, while others will be very much against this idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And then the other thing we could even raise is, again, to go back to this point of critical enablers, that sometimes the purchasing decisions, I think this is a real challenge moving forward, the purchasing decisions might be made in a way that are not designed, they don't produce the best capability outcomes, put it that way. And that could be either because of domestic political factors, or because countries are trying to please the United States, but that they don't end up purchasing. They're spending more, but they're not spending more in the best possible way to achieve their security objectives.
I would like to move away a bit from the European defense industry and defense industrial complex and bring the conversation very briefly to one player in NATO that we haven't touched upon yet, and that is also not included in your book. So I won't grill you too much with questions here, but I'm intrigued by the fact that we have quite a lot of questions on that here in the chat, and that is the role of Turkey in NATO and as a partner in European security. Do you have thoughts on how Turkey's role could evolve in NATO in the future, knowing that it is purely from a capability perspective already a significant player in the alliance, and that it also really has a pivotal position in really geopolitical terms? So what do you make of Turkey's position in the alliance today? And perhaps also, how does Washington see Turkey when there is talk about the future of European security and stronger European contribution? Is this only EU-Europe or EU-Europe plus perhaps Norway and the UK? Or is this also including Turkey?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So first of all, I would just say geographically, if we take the threat from Russia seriously, and I do think that will be the most important threat to the alliance as a whole, right? To most of the members of the alliance, that Turkey's position on the Black Sea is going to be critical. While there is a lot of focus on the eastern flank, and specifically the Baltic states and Poland as potential places where Russia could intervene, particularly if we saw the naval balance in the Black Sea tip, there would at least be the risk of some sort of Russian action in the Black Sea. And so I think that continues to be a huge part of why Turkey is important for the alliance as a whole. I am not an expert, but I wonder the extent to which Turkey resolves or gets the Kurdish problem under control from its perspective. Of course, Turkey has a broader security environment that isn't just focused on Russia, but the extent to which the possibility or concern with the Russia threat matters maybe more for Turkey in that context. The good news with the Trump administration is that Trump seems to be, as far as I know, fine with dealing with Erdogan. He likes kind of tough, I think he's said very positive things about Erdogan before, because he's a tough leader, a tough negotiator, things along those lines. So that's encouraging. So yeah, I am hopeful that the alliance can keep Turkey engaged and keep Turkey on board, and that Turkey's views continue to be consistent with the main function of the alliance. I should note as well, I'm doing some additional follow-on work on the NATO and the southern flank, and as I alluded to before, Turkey has been very positive in terms of NATO's role in the southern flank. So, for example, as I mentioned, Operation Sea Guardian activities in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. Now we've done almost the NATO 360, but still have a tiny bit of time. So I would like to shift the conversation to looking forward, actually, and what we can expect in the next perhaps months, years to come on European security and NATO. I think we've all followed the news, and there seems to be another transatlantic fallout almost every day. But when you think about the alliance very structurally, also as you have done this deep research on threat perceptions and how allies do things like defense spending and defense decision making, What do you think are the most important challenges for the alliance moving forward? And when we think about NATO reform and a bigger European contribution?
Right. So the first thing that I would be focused on in terms of challenges moving forward is a plan for the Europeans to develop those critical enablers that I mentioned. So since I haven't had a chance to really say more, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance is one of the most important ones, but there are others. Suppression of enemy air defense is another one that people talk about. Long range fires is another one I heard a lot about in my interviews. Things that the Europeans need to develop so that if the United States, at least from a conventional perspective, withdraws some of its capabilities from Europe, and particularly if we had the scenario where there was a conflict involving Russia and China at the same time, that Europeans would be able to focus on the Russian threat themselves while the United States focused on the threat in the Indo-Pacific from China. So developing those critical enablers would be number one in terms of challenges that I see for the alliance moving forward. Let me also say, I do think even though it seems like a relatively minor point, and I think we did talk about the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan before. I do think the extent to which that NATO can continue to engage in relatively low cost engagement with partners in the Middle East and North Africa, and conceivably moving forward in maybe the Sahel, that engaging in partner activities, training, joint training and exercises, those sorts of things in counterterrorism capacity, for example, that could be really useful for the alliances on the southern flank of the alliance, and they could address their concerns and then keep those allies more on board. And then the final thing that I would say that alludes to the Greenland crisis is I do think the extent to which the alliance is making these moves to do more in the Arctic makes perfect sense because of the effects of climate change on ability to move around in the Arctic is going to make the Arctic an increasingly important area for European security.
Thank you. So staying on the short term, there's also a major event in the alliance coming up soon, namely Ankara Summit. Do you already have insights on expectations from the US administrations, but also the Europeans? Is it about just doing what was done in The Hague and trying to get it over without a diplomatic fallout and a major catastrophe? Or are there actual expectations that are a bit higher for the summit?
That's a good question. I have not heard much from the US side in terms of what people in the administration are talking about. The one thing that I would be concerned with that I'll raise that we haven't discussed yet is if you recall the Hague Summit, when the administration achieved this aim of stating that allies would spend 3.5% of GDP on defense and 1.5% on defense-related things like infrastructure, so like roads and bridges that would allow military mobility. There was a lot of discussion initially about, or statements by the administration about how soon that would happen. Of course, the reality is very few European governments are anywhere near hitting 3.5% of GDP on defense. And that's unlikely to change in the next year or two from all the indicators that we have. So my big concern for the Ankara summit would be that the administration tries too hard to get some sort of new deadline that is maybe, by the end of this administration for allies to achieve that goal. Because I think it would be setting up the alliance for failure. So that would be a big concern.
Okay, I know that we often talk concerns and challenges in NATO and in transatlantic relations at the moment. But I always like ending webinars in this kind of conversation also a bit on a positive note. So is there anything that keeps you optimistic about the future of NATO today?
Yes. So all of those in the webinar will be familiar with what happened with regard to Greenland just several weeks ago. I think the most important part of that story is that from everything that we know, the reason why Donald Trump backed down on threats of force against Greenland is because Europeans stuck together, and they were actively discussing moving forward with, roughly $100 billion of tariffs. They were talking about the anti-coercion measure, the bazooka. The European Parliament had paused the passage of the trade deal with the United States. The extent to which, and I think Europeans learned that lesson, right? So my hope moving forward is that there both is the lesson learned in Washington, that there are limits to what I think they were woefully unprepared for European unity. But second of all, that there are places that they should not go in terms of their demands, and that the Europeans learned the lesson that if we get into a situation like the one that happened with regard to Greenland, that we have to stick together, even when maybe some individual countries care more and some care less about the issue of dispute, that if we stick together, we can force the US and Donald Trump to back down. So that leaves me with optimism for the future of the relationship, that both sides seem to have, and I hope have learned a really valuable lesson from that conflict.
Thank you so much. And I think that we all in this webinar here today have learned a lot of valuable lessons from you as well, learning on going forward, and on the future of NATO, the future of European security, and perhaps also leave with a note of optimism despite all the challenges that lie ahead. With that, that is again a general reminder that Jason's book, NATO After Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Threat Perceptions and Their Consequences, published with Georgetown University Press, is available online and I guess also in bookshops in the United States and perhaps in Europe. Haven't checked it yet in Switzerland, but I'm sure we will get there. So thank you again very much, Jason, for sharing your insights and your time with us. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in this webinar today. To stay in touch, do subscribe to CSS newsletters to receive updates and on insights and future events. And with that, I say again, thank you all for joining. Happy Monday and have a good rest of your day. See you very soon at the CSS Web Talk.
Thank you, Gazina. Thank you, everyone.